There is a specific moment when almost every student loses control, and it doesn't happen when you are too tired, nor when the subject is too difficult, but precisely when you start off well, create a small rhythm, feel that you have finally hit your stride, and then, without realizing it, break that cycle with a lost day, a poorly slept night, or a distraction that seemed harmless. Because the truth is that discipline is not lost all at once, it slowly seeps through the cracks of routine until the day you look back and realize that motivation is gone, consistency has evaporated, and studying has become a heavy and emotionally exhausting effort again. Maybe you recognize this pattern. You start the week focused, attend classes, take notes, promise that this time it will be different, but as the days go by, your brain starts looking for shortcuts, your phone becomes an extension of your hand, procrastination appears disguised as well-deserved rest, and when you realize it, studying no longer seems a natural part of your day. It feels like a sacrifice that requires constant willpower. The problem is that almost no one has taught you how to build real discipline, because discipline does not come from motivation, nor from inspirational quotes, and certainly not from extreme routines copied from the internet. It comes from understanding how the brain learns, how it responds to prolonged effort, and why, without a proper system, your mental energy will always collapse before the result appears. If you've ever felt that you have potential but can't maintain the pace for long enough, this video is not about studying more hours, but about learning to create a discipline that doesn't depend on momentary willpower, but on mental structure. And if this type of content interests you, it's worth subscribing now, because from now on the conversation gets serious. If you carefully observe how most people study today, you will realize that the problem is rarely a lack of intelligence or an inability to learn, but rather a mental environment completely misaligned with the actual functioning of the brain, because we have been pushed into a study model based on brute effort, long hours sitting, forced concentration, and constant guilt for not performing as expected. From an early age, studying was presented as something that requires suffering, strict discipline, and emotional endurance, almost as if learning were a test of who can withstand the most pressure, rather than a cognitive process that depends on rhythm, predictability, and neurological reward. This causes many students to automatically associate studying with fatigue, anxiety, and frustration, creating an internal rejection response even before opening the material. At the same time, we live surrounded by rapid stimuli, constant notifications, and instant rewards, training the brain every day to seek immediate pleasure and avoid any activity that does not offer quick returns. And when you try to study without a system that respects this reality, the conflict is inevitable because the brain does not see enough value in that prolonged effort. That's why so many people start motivated and give up halfway, not because they are weak, but because they are using the wrong model, trying to sustain discipline only with willpower, when in fact they should be building an internal environment that makes studying almost automatic, predictable, and mentally sustainable. Understanding this context is the first step to stop blaming yourself and start adjusting the process, because discipline is not a personality trait, it is a direct consequence of how you organize effort, reward, and rest throughout the day. The central idea that changes everything is simple, but uncomfortable to accept at first. Study discipline is not a moral skill, it is not about being strong, focused, or better than others, but rather a predictable side effect of a system that communicates correctly with the brain, because when the brain understands what comes next, how much effort will be required, and when the reward appears, it stops resisting and starts cooperating. The most common mistake is trying to study the same way every day, expecting different results, believing that, at some point, motivation will appear out of nowhere and sustain weeks or months of continuous effort, when in practice motivation is volatile, emotional, and highly context-dependent, which makes it a fragile foundation for any long-term project. Real discipline is born when you reduce initial friction, structure the effort into blocks that the brain considers acceptable, and create small signs of progress that release dopamine consistently, because the brain does not work well with distant promises, it responds to what is clear, measurable, and close in time. This means that studying correctly is not about studying more, nor studying until exhaustion, but studying in a way that preserves mental energy, avoids unnecessary decisions, and transforms the act of sitting down to study into something almost automatic, without internal drama and constant emotional negotiations. From here on, everything in this video will revolve around this thesis. It's not about becoming a more disciplined person, but about building a system that makes discipline inevitable, even on days when you are not motivated. When you try to study without a clear pattern, deciding every day the time, the content, the duration, and even the method right before starting, what seems like freedom on the surface quickly turns into mental exhaustion, because each decision consumes cognitive energy even before the study begins, and this initial weariness is enough to trigger the internal resistance you feel as laziness, discouragement, or the urge to procrastinate. The human brain seeks predictability because predictability reduces energy costs, and that is exactly why habits become automatic over time, not because you became stronger, but because the brain stopped needing to decide, evaluate, and negotiate each step, entering an almost silent execution mode. In studying, this means that discipline does not start when you open the book, but much earlier, in the way you eliminate unnecessary choices, set fixed schedules, create simple starting rituals, and establish clear boundaries for the end, because when the brain knows exactly when it starts, what happens, and when it ends, anxiety decreases and motivation increases. Many students believe they need to feel ready to study, when in fact the feeling of readiness is a consequence of repeated action in a predictable context, not the other way around, because the brain only releases deep focus after it perceives consistency and security in the process. It is at this point that studying stops being an emotional event and becomes a programmed behavior, something that happens regardless of the day's mood, and this transition, from chaos to structure, is the first real step to building sustainable discipline. There is a silent point where many students give up, and it doesn't happen on the first day or the first week, but when the effort starts to accumulate without a real sense of progress, because the brain tolerates intense work for short periods, but collapses when it doesn't perceive clear advancement, predictable reward, or immediate meaning in that prolonged effort. When you study without measuring anything, without closing cycles, and without ending sessions with a sense of completion, the brain registers only fatigue, not learning, creating a negative association that strengthens each day, until sitting down to study starts generating tension even before you open the material. That's why so many people feel disciplined for a few days and then simply lose their rhythm, not due to a lack of character or willpower, but because they are accumulating cognitive fatigue without emotional compensation, which causes the brain to activate mechanisms of escape, distraction, and procrastination as a form of self-protection. Discipline is sustained when study is divided into blocks that have a clear beginning, middle, and end, when there is a conscious closure of each session, and when small victories are recognized, even if the final goal is still distant, because the brain needs to feel that the effort was worth it now, and not just in some abstract future. If you have ever felt that you were doing everything right, but still lost consistency, perhaps the problem was never your ability to put in effort, but the fact that no one taught you how to preserve mental energy along the way. And if this has already happened to you, comment later, because in the next step the turning point starts to become clear. The turning point happens when you understand that discipline should not reside within you, as a personal characteristic that needs to be accessed every day, but outside, in the way the environment, schedule, and structure push you towards studying almost without internal negotiation, because expecting the brain to choose effort in a world full of distractions is a bet that, sooner or later, always fails. The disciplined student is not the one who wins internal battles daily, but the one who has built a scenario where not studying becomes more uncomfortable than studying, where the schedule arrives, the ritual begins, and the body simply follows along, even if the mind is still slow, because the system has already been trained to start before motivation appears. At this point, something changes internally. Studying ceases to be a conscious decision and becomes an automatic response to a clear trigger, whether it's the same time every day, the same location, or the same prior preparation, creating a cycle where action precedes will, and not the other way around. This is the difference between those who study in bursts of excitement and those who build real discipline, because while one depends on the emotional state of the day, the other relies on a predictable system that works even on bad days, on tired days, and on days when motivation simply doesn't show up. From here on, it's no longer about asking yourself if you will study today, but about accepting that studying is already part of your day, just like eating or sleeping, and when that happens, discipline stops being a constant effort and transforms into a practical identity. One of the biggest mistakes that keeps students trapped in cycles of frustrated effort is believing that discipline is born from intensity, when in fact it is born from controlled repetition, because studying intensely for a few days creates an illusion of commitment, but it comes at too high a price to be sustained for weeks or months. Another dangerous myth is thinking that studying for many consecutive hours is a sign of productivity, when, from a neurological standpoint, long periods without clear breaks drastically reduce the ability to consolidate memory, causing you to spend more time studying and, paradoxically, learn less, accumulating only fatigue and a sense of unproductiveness. There is also the invisible obstacle of comparison, which leads many young people to copy unrealistic routines from others, without considering context, available energy, or current level of cognitive maturity, creating unattainable expectations and a constant sense of failure for not being able to maintain a standard that was never meant for them. Moreover, studying without a clear criterion for closure causes the brain to never fully shut down, maintaining a background tension throughout the day, as if the study were always unfinished, which gradually erodes the willingness to return the next day and weakens discipline over time. Avoiding these mistakes doesn't require more willpower, but more awareness of how the brain responds to effort, and if this content makes sense to you, leave a like afterward, because it helps the channel continue bringing this kind of in-depth analysis. When you look at serious research on learning, memory, and habit formation, a pattern begins to consistently appear. The brain learns better when effort is distributed, predictable, and associated with clear closures, because it is in these moments that real memory consolidation occurs, especially during breaks and after the end of the study session. Studies in cognitive neuroscience show that moderate sessions, repeated over time, activate the hippocampus more efficiently, the area responsible for transforming information into long-term memory, while study marathons activate the stress system more than the learning system, raising cortisol and impairing retention, even when the person feels they have produced a lot. Moreover, dopamine, which many people associate only with pleasure, is actually a neurotransmitter of anticipation and progress, and it is released when the brain perceives concrete advancement toward a clear goal, which explains why systems with small, measurable, and frequent goals create more discipline than vague and distant plans. When you finish a study block knowing exactly what was done, what was learned, and when you return, the brain registers that effort as something successful, reinforcing the behavior and increasing the likelihood of repetition the next day, without you needing to force yourself emotionally. That's why students who seem naturally disciplined often just organize the process in a way that respects the biology of the brain, creating a cycle where studying generates less resistance and more sense of control, something anyone can learn to build with the right system. In practice, studying correctly means stopping improvisation and starting to operate with a simple, predictable, and repeatable system, because that is what allows the brain to save energy and maintain consistency without relying on daily motivation, and the first element of this system is a fixed, non-negotiable schedule that serves as an automatic trigger for the start of studying. Instead of studying when you have spare time, you set a specific block of the day for studying, even if the duration is moderate, because regularity is more important than intensity, and over time the brain starts to prepare itself for that moment, drastically reducing initial resistance. The second element is a single goal per session, clear and closed, something you can complete within that block, like solving a specific set of problems or understanding a defined concept, avoiding endless lists that never end and only create a constant feeling of being behind. The third point is conscious closure, where you finish studying knowing exactly what was done, what is pending, and when you will resume, as this closure signals to the brain that the effort has a clear end, allowing the mind to relax and recover, which increases the willingness to return the next day. When this system is in operation, discipline ceases to be a daily struggle and becomes a natural consequence of the structure, because you don't need to decide whether to study, just follow the next step that has already been defined. In the end, building study discipline has nothing to do with becoming a different person overnight, but with stopping the fight against your own brain and starting to work with it, because when the process is clear, predictable, and respects the limits of mental energy, studying stops being an emotional burden and takes on a stable place in your life. What destroys discipline is not the lack of ability, but the absence of a system that protects your focus over time, and when you understand this, guilt begins to lose its power, giving way to a more strategic posture, where each decision is made to reduce friction, preserve energy, and maintain consistency. From that point on, studying stops depending on peaks of motivation or rare moments of inspiration, because it becomes part of your practical identity, something you do even on ordinary days, on tired days, and on days when nothing seems special, and it is precisely this silent regularity that generates real results in the long run. If you apply this model, you won't feel like you're forcing yourself all the time, but rather that you're just following a pre-prepared path, and as the weeks go by, the discipline that once seemed distant begins to manifest naturally, almost without conscious effort. And if this type of content has helped you see studying in a different light, subscribe to the channel and consider supporting the project, because there is still a lot of profound material to explore about learning, focus, and building a solid intellectual life.